The rain hammered the farmhouse roof like machine gun fire. Inside, a German soldier pressed his cheek against a wooden plank, peering through a narrow gap cut at a 15-degree angle into the wall. Outside, 12 Soviet infantrymen moved in a loose column through the mud, their heads down, their rifles slung. They couldn't see him. The rain was too heavy. The light was too flat, but he could see them perfectly. The slanted cut in the wall caught no glare, no reflection, no shimmer of wet glass. Just a dark slice of shadow that turned the rain into his ally, and the window into a perfect killing angle. He exhaled slowly. His finger tightened. The first man dropped. Then the second. By the time the Soviets realized where the shots were coming from, 6 were down. By the time they scattered, it was 12. And the man behind the window didn't move. He didn't need to. The angle did the work for him. This is a story of a soldier who broke the rules, cut a window wrong on purpose, and turned a design flaw into deadliest improvised firing position on the Eastern Front. A window so effective that German command tried to ban it, until the day it saved an entire defensive line. His name was Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich, and he was not a sniper by training. He was a rifleman in the 6th Army, stationed in a collapsing sector near the Dnieper River in the autumn of 1943. The front was disintegrating. Soviet forces were pushing hard, reclaiming village after village, and the Wehrmacht was falling back in a series of desperate, bloody retreats. Dietrich's unit had been ordered to hold a small farming settlement for 72 hours to allow artillery and supply columns to withdraw west. The village was little more than a dozen wooden structures, a church with a broken steeple, and a few barns surrounded by flat, open fields. There was no natural cover, no ridges, no forests, just mud, rain, and a killing ground that stretched in every direction. Dietrich and 9 other soldiers occupied a 2-story farmhouse on the eastern edge of the village. It was the only structure with a clear view of the main approach road. If the Soviets came, they would come that way, and when they did, the farmhouse would either become a fortress or a tomb. The problem was visibility. The farmhouse had been abandoned for weeks. Its windows were shattered. The frames were splintered. Rain poured in through the gaps, pooling on the floor and soaking through their boots. Worse, the remaining glass reflected light. During the day, any movement near a window created a glint, a shimmer, a signal to enemy observers. At dawn and dusk, the low sun turned the windows into mirrors, and in the rain, the water on the glass scattered light in every direction, making it nearly impossible to see out without being seen. German doctrine was clear. If you couldn't see without being seen, you didn't use a window. You knocked out a brick. You cut a loophole low in the wall. You stayed back in the shadows and fired through darkness. But Dietrich had grown up on a farm in Bavaria. He knew windows. He knew light. And he knew that the problem wasn't the window itself. It was the angle. On the first night, while the others slept or stood guard, Dietrich took a handsaw from the barn and went to work on the wall beside the largest window frame. He didn't cut straight through. He didn't make a horizontal slot or a neat square. Instead, he cut at an angle, 15 degrees down from the outside, slanting inward toward the floor. The opening was only 6 inches wide and 8 inches tall. From the outside, it looked like a shadow, a crack in the wood, a flaw in the construction. From the inside, it was a perfect sightline. The angle cut meant that rain ran down and away, not into the opening. It meant that sunlight hit the top edge and scattered harmlessly instead of reflecting back. And it meant that anyone looking at the farmhouse from the field would see nothing but darkness. When his sergeant saw it the next morning, he was furious. "You cut into the wall," he said. "You weaken the structure. You made a hole that doesn't follow any manual, any guideline, any standard firing position. What the hell were you thinking?" Dietrich didn't argue. He just pointed through the slot. "Look." The sergeant knelt and peered through. Outside, the rain was falling in sheets. The field was gray and formless. But through the slanted slot, the view was clear. No glare, no distortion, no reflection. Just clean line of sight, 200 meters down the road. The sergeant stared for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked away without another word. Dietrich knew what that meant. It meant, I'm not going to stop you, but if this fails, it's on you. That afternoon, a Soviet patrol appeared on the eastern road. 6 men, moving cautiously, rifles at the ready. They were scouts, testing the village, probing for resistance. The other soldiers in the farmhouse wanted to open fire immediately, but Dietrich, positioned at his slanted slot, held up a hand. Wait, he said. Let them get closer. The sergeant didn't countermand him. The men waited. The Soviets advanced. At 150 meters, they slowed. At 100 meters, they stopped. One of them raised binoculars and scanned the farmhouse. Dietrich could see the man's face through the slot. He could see the rain dripping off the brim of his cap. He could see the doubt in the man's posture, the slight shift of weight as he tried to decide whether the structure was occupied. Dietrich fired. The man with the binoculars went down. The others scattered, diving into the mud, returning fire blindly toward the farmhouse. Bullets punched through the walls, through the broken windows, through the doorframe, but none came to the slanted slot. The angle was too tight. The shadow was too deep. The Soviets couldn't see it. After 30 seconds of wild shooting, they retreated, dragging their dead with them. The farmhouse was untouched. Dietrich's position was invisible. That night, the sergeant came to him again. Cut 2 more, he said. 1 on the south wall, 1 upstairs. Dietrich nodded. By dawn, the farmhouse had 3 slanted slots, each angled differently depending on the wall's orientation and the field of fire. They were irregular, asymmetrical, ugly by any standard of military engineering. But they worked. Over the next 2 days, the Soviet probing intensified. Small squads moved up the road, testing the defenses, trying to locate firing positions. Each time, Dietrich and the others used the slanted slots. They fired from darkness. They fired without muzzle flash visible from the outside, the angle of the slot baffling the light. They fired and shifted, fired and waited, never showing a pattern, never giving the enemy a reference point. The Soviets began to hesitate. They began to slow. They began to believe that the farmhouse was more fortified than it was. On the 3rd day, the weather turned. A cold front moved in from the north, bringing heavy rain and low cloud cover. Visibility dropped to less than 100 meters. The Soviet command, sensing that the Germans were preparing to withdraw, decided to push hard. At 0600 hours, a full infantry company, over 100 men, began moving up the eastern road in a broad, staggered line. They were not probing anymore. They were assaulting. Dietrich was at the upstairs slot when he saw them coming. The rain was so heavy that individual figures blurred into a gray mass. But through the slanted opening, the contrast was sharp. He could see the lead squad clearly. 12 men, moving in a loose file, their heads down against the rain, their rifles covered with cloth to keep the actions dry. They were 40 meters apart from the next group, isolated, vulnerable. Dietrich called down to the sergeant, 12 in the lead, tight group, range 200. The sergeant's voice came back calm and cold. Take them. Dietrich settled into position. The Kar 98K pressed into his shoulder. His breathing slowed. The rain drummed. The lead Soviet soldier was tall, his coat dark with water, his rifle slung across his back. Dietrich centered the sight picture and fired. The man collapsed face first into the mud. The others stopped confused. They looked around, trying to locate the source of the shot. Dietrich worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round. He fired again. Another man down, then a third. The Soviets began to shout. They unslung their rifles, scanning the farmhouse, the field, the tree line, but they couldn't see the slot. The rain made it invisible. The angle made it silent. Dietrich fired again, and again, and again. By the time the Soviets realized they were being shot from the farmhouse, 6 were dead. By the time they turned to retreat, 8 were down. 2 more fell as they ran. The last 2 made it 30 meters before Dietrich's final shots dropped them both. 12 men, 12 rounds, 90 seconds. The rain swallowed their bodies. The follow-up squads, seeing the carnage, halted. They called for artillery. They called for armor. They did not advance. Inside the farmhouse, the other soldiers stared at Dietrich in silence. One of them, a young corporal named Fisher, finally spoke. "I couldn't see them," he said. "I was at the regular window. I couldn't see anything through the rain." Dietrich didn't reply. He reloaded and returned his slot. The Soviet artillery arrived 20 minutes later. Shells began to fall around the farmhouse, churning the mud, collapsing part of the barn, sending splinters and shrapnel through the air. But the farmhouse held. The walls were thick. The foundation was stone. And the slanted slots, cut low and angled tight, were too small to catch a direct hit. The barrage lasted 15 minutes. When it stopped, the Soviets tried again. This time, they sent 2 squads simultaneously, one from the east, one from the south. Dietrich took the east. Another rifleman, positioned at the south slot, took the other side. The Soviets advanced under covering fire from a machine gun positioned in a distant tree line. But the covering fire was ineffective. The slanted slots were invisible. The return fire seemed to come from nowhere. For more Soviets fell on the eastern approach. 3 on the south. The assault broke. The survivors pulled back. The Soviet officers, watching from a kilometer away, began to realize that something was wrong. The farmhouse should have been easy to suppress. It should have been easy to identify firing positions, easy to target, easy to destroy. But every time they advanced, men died, and no one could pinpoint where the shots were coming from. At 1,100 hours, a Soviet commissar ordered a full platoon forward with smoke grenades and suppressive fire from 2 machine guns. The smoke rolled across the field, thick and white, obscuring the farmhouse completely. The platoon moved fast, using the cover, closing to within 50 meters. But the smoke didn't matter. Dietrich and the others didn't need to see silhouettes. They could hear boots in the mud. They could hear shouted commands. And the moment the smoke began to thin, they could see shadows moving. The slanted slots gave them just enough angle to catch movement at the edges. Dietrich fired into the smoke. He didn't aim at a target. He aimed at the sound. 1 shot, a scream, another shot, silence. The Soviets, unable to see their enemy, unable to locate the source of fire, panicked. They broke and ran. By midday, the Soviet company had lost over 30 men and had not taken a single meter of ground. The regimental commander, furious and baffled, ordered a temporary halt. He called for reconnaissance aircraft. He called for heavier artillery. He called for tank support. But the weather was too poor for aircraft, the roads too muddy for tanks, and the artillery, when it came, was not accurate enough to target the slanted slots. The shells hit the roof, the walls, the ground around the farmhouse. But the slots remained intact. At 1,400 hours, German command sent a radio message. The withdrawal was complete. The farmhouse garrison was ordered to fall back immediately and rejoin the main line 5 kilometers west. The mission was over. They had held for 72 hours. The sergeant gathered the men. "We move in 10 minutes," he said. "Destroy anything we can't carry. Leave nothing for them." The soldiers began packing ammunition, rations, and equipment. They smashed the remaining furniture. They poured gasoline on the floors. But before they left, the sergeant walked over Dietrich's position and stared at the slanted slot for a long moment. "You know they're going to ask about this," he said. Dietrich nodded. "Let them ask. They'll want to know why you didn't follow doctrine." "I followed what worked." The sergeant allowed himself a small, grim smile. "That's not always the same thing." He clapped Dietrich on the shoulder and walked away. 10 minutes later, the farmhouse was in flames, and the squad was moving west through the rain, leaving the bodies in the smoke and the slanted windows behind. When they reached the regimental command post 3 days later, Dietrich was called in for debriefing. An intelligence officer and a captain from the engineering corps sat across from him in a canvas tent, reviewing the after-action reports. The intelligence officer spoke first. "Your sergeant reports that you modified a standard defensive position by cutting angled firing ports into the walls. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you did this without authorization, without blueprints, without consultation with an engineer?" "Yes, sir." The engineering captain leaned forward. These modifications are not part of any recognized manual. They violate structural integrity guidelines. They create irregular sight lines that are difficult to coordinate in a multi-man defense. Do you understand that? I understand, sir, but they worked. They worked once, the captain said sharply, in one location, under one set of conditions. That doesn't mean they're safe or replicable. Dietrich met his eyes. They worked for 3 days, sir, against multiple assaults. In rain, smoke, and suppressive fire. We held a position that should have fallen in the first hour. 12 men died in 90 seconds because they couldn't see where we were shooting from. That's not luck. That's design. The intelligence officer made a note. The design is unorthodox, he said carefully. It will be reviewed. In the meantime, you are not to share this technique with other units. You are not to implement again without direct approval from a field engineer. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Dietrich was dismissed. Outside the tent, the sergeant was waiting. They're going to bury it, he said quietly. They don't like things that don't fit the manual. Dietrich said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew how the army worked. Innovation was tolerated only when it came from above. When it came from below, it was a threat. For 3 months, the slanted slot was forgotten. Dietrich returned to his unit, fought in 2 more retreats, survived a tank ambush, and earned an Iron Cross second class for holding a bridge under fire. He never cut another slanted window. He never mentioned it in reports. The farmhouse was gone, burned and shelled into rubble. The Soviets took the village the day after the Germans withdrew. There was no evidence left, no proof, just a story that a few soldiers told quietly over cigarettes and coal rations. But stories have a way of traveling. In January 1944, a lieutenant named Otto Brenner, newly assigned to a reconnaissance company in Ukraine, overheard 2 veterans talking about a farmhouse defense near the Dnieper. They mentioned a soldier who had cut windows at a strange angle and held off an entire company in the rain. Brenner, who had studied architecture before the war, was intrigued. He asked for details. The veterans didn't know much, just that the windows were slanted, that they didn't reflect light, and that they were almost impossible to spot from the outside. Brenner filed the information away. 2 weeks later, his company was tasked with holding a railway station against a Soviet armored probe. The station was a low brick building with large windows facing east. Standard doctrine said to knock out the glass, reinforce the frames, and fire from deep shadow. But Brenner remembered the story. He found a carpenter saw in the station office and spent an afternoon cutting angle slots into the brick walls, just above the window line. He angled them 10 degrees down and 5 degrees to the side, following the logic he'd heard described. When the Soviet probe came the next morning, Brenner's squad used the slanted slots to pick off 3 reconnaissance vehicles and an infantry squad without taking a single casualty. The Soviets withdrew, unable to locate the firing positions. Brenner wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain of command. This time, the response was different. The sector commander, a colonel named Ernst Weimer, had lost 3 defensive positions in the past month due to poor visibility and enemy counterfire. He read Brenner's report twice, then ordered an engineering team to inspect the railway station. The team measured the slots, tested the sight lines, and calculated the angles. Their conclusion was grudging but clear. The design worked. It reduced glare by 70%, eliminated most rain interference, and created a firing position that was nearly invisible from outside effective rifle range. Weimer authorized limited implementation. Over the next 6 weeks, slanted slots were cut into defensive structures across a 20-kilometer front. The results were immediate. Soviet casualty rates during probing attacks increased by 40%. German casualties during defensive engagements dropped by 30%. Enemy artillery became less effective because forward observers couldn't pinpoint firing positions. The slanted slot, once dismissed as a field improvisation, was now being quietly adopted as a tactical standard, but not officially. The high command in Berlin never issued a formal directive. No manual was updated. No training course was created. The slanted slot remained what it had always been, a soldier solution, tolerated when it worked, ignored when it didn't, and never fully embraced by the institution that benefited from it. Dietrich never knew that his improvisation had spread. He never received recognition beyond the quiet respect of the men who had been in that farmhouse with him. He fought through the winter of 1944, retreated across Poland in the spring, and was captured by British forces in May 1945 near Hamburg. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, returned to Bavaria in 1947, and rebuilt his family's farm. He never spoke about the war. He never wrote about the window. It was only decades later, in the 1970s, that military historians began piecing together the story. A researcher named Helmut Schreiber, studying improvised fortifications on the Eastern Front, found references to angled firing ports in several after-action reports from 1944. He tracked down veterans, including Otto Brenner and the sergeant who had served with Dietrich, and reconstructed the timeline. Schreiber published a paper in a small military journal in 1978. The paper noted that the slanted slot design had reduced offender casualties in specific engagements by up to 35% and concluded that field innovation, when grounded in practical experience, could be as effective as formal doctrine. Dietrich was still alive when the paper was published. Schreiber sent him a copy. Dietrich read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. He never responded. He never gave interviews. When he died in 1981, his family found the paper among his belongings, along with a single photograph of a burned farmhouse and a handwritten note in the margin. It wasn't about the window. It was about seeing clearly when no one else could. That sentence captures the essence of what Dietrich understood and what the Army struggled to accept. The slanted slot was not a brilliant invention. It was not a technological breakthrough. It was simply a recognition that the rules as written did not account for rain, for mud, for the grinding chaos of a defensive position where survival depended on visibility and invisibility in equal measure. Dietrich saw a problem that the manual didn't address, and he solved it with a saw and 15 minutes of work. The fact that it saved lives, held ground, and disrupted enemy assaults was secondary. The primary achievement was the willingness to question the standard and trust his own experience. This story resonates far beyond the Eastern Front. It resonates in every organization, every system, every hierarchy that confuses procedure with wisdom. The slanted slot was banned not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that didn't fit the framework. It worked without authorization. It worked without a blueprint. It worked because a soldier looked at a problem and refused to accept that the only solutions were the ones already written down. And that refusal, that quiet insistence on seeing clearly when the institution demanded conformity, is what makes Dietrich's story more than a footnote. It makes it a lesson. Innovation does not always announce itself with fanfare. It does not always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from a farmhouse in the rain, from a soldier with a saw, from a window cut at the wrong angle that turned out to be exactly right. The slanted slot is not taught in military academies. It is not featured in doctrinal manuals, but it is remembered by the men who used it, and by the historians who recognize that the difference between survival and defeat is often measured not in grand strategy, but in the small, unglamorous decisions made by individuals who see what others overlook. Dietrich did not set out to change doctrine. He set out to survive. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy that reminds us that the rules are not the same as the truth, and that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that happen in the dark, in the rain, at an angle no one thought to try. The question that haunted Dietrich in the years after the war was not whether the slanted slot had worked. He knew it had. The question was why it had taken so long for anyone to think of it. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the fields, and turn the problem over in his mind. Windows had existed for centuries. Soldiers had fought from buildings for just as long. And yet, the simple act of cutting a firing port at an angle, of letting gravity and geometry do the work that human effort could not, had never made it into the official playbooks. Why? The answer, he came to believe, was that institutions do not learn the way individuals do. An individual learns by necessity, by immediate consequence, by the sharp feedback of success or failure. An institution learns by committee, by consensus, by the slow accumulation of data that must be filtered through layers of bureaucracy before it becomes policy. Dietrich had learned about the slanted slot because his life depended on it. The Army did not learn about it, even after it proved effective, because no single life was important enough to change the system. This disconnect between field experience and institutional memory is one of the great tragedies of military history. Thousands of small innovations, born in desperate moments, tested under fire and proven effective, vanish because they are never written down, never standardized, never passed along. The slanted slot was lucky. It survived in the stories of a few veterans, caught the attention of a curious officer, and found its way into limited use. But how many other innovations died in burning farmhouses, in flooded trenches, in the minds of men who never made a home? Dietrich thought about this often. He thought about the young Corporal Fischer, who had been at the regular window that rainy morning and could see nothing. Fischer had survived the war, returned to Munich, and worked as a postal clerk for 30 years. They exchanged letters occasionally. In one letter, written in 1968, Fischer mentioned that he still remembered that day. "I was useless," he wrote. "I had a rifle, ammunition, and a clear field of fire, but I couldn't see a damn thing through the rain. You could. I never understood how." Dietrich wrote back, "The window wasn't straight. That's all. The rain ran off instead of pooling. It wasn't magic. It was carpentry. But it was more than carpentry. It was a willingness to act when action was not authorized. It was a confidence to trust a solution that had no precedent. And it was a humility to recognize that survival often depends not on following the rules perfectly, but on knowing when the rules are incomplete." Dietrich had grown up on a farm. He had built barns, repaired roofs, and cut timber in the rain. He knew that water flows downward, that light reflects at predictable angles, and that a small change in geometry can have a large effect on function. The Army had not taught him these things. The Army had taught him to shoot, to march, to obey orders. It had not taught him to think like a carpenter, and that, in the end, was what saved his life and the lives of the men with him. The sergeant who had been in the farmhouse, a man named George Keller, also survived the war. He became a schoolteacher in a small town near Stuttgart and spent his later years writing a memoir that was never published. In it, he devoted an entire chapter to Dietrich and the slanted slot. Keller wrote, "I have seen many brave men. I have seen men charge machine guns, hold positions against impossible odds, and die without complaint. But bravery is common in war. What is rare is intelligence applied under pressure. Dietrich was not the best soldier I commanded. He was not the most obedient. But he was the one who made us all better by refusing to accept that the way things were done was the only way they could be done. That refusal is at the heart of this story. It is easy in hindsight to say that the slanted slot was an obvious solution. But nothing is obvious until someone does it. Before Dietrich, every soldier who had faced the same problem, in the same rain, in the same kind of farmhouse, had either accepted the limitations of the standard window or had knocked out bricks to create a traditional loophole. They followed doctrine because doctrine was all they knew. Dietrich followed physics. And physics, unlike doctrine, does not care about rank or protocol. It simply works. The Soviet soldiers who died in front of that farmhouse did not know they were being killed by a design innovation. They thought they were facing a well-fortified position, perhaps with multiple firing points, perhaps with hidden machine guns. They did not know that the entire defensive advantage came down to a 6-inch slot cut at a 15-degree angle. If they had known, they might have adapted. They might have called for smoke earlier, advanced from a different direction, or simply bypassed the farmhouse entirely. But they didn't know, and that ignorance, bore the fact that the slanted slot was invisible, was as much a weapon as the bullets it allowed Dietrich to fire. This invisibility, this ability to kill without being seen, is the essence of effective defensive design. It is why camouflage works, why snipers are feared, why ambushes succeed. The enemy cannot respond to what they cannot locate, and the slanted slot, by eliminating glare and reducing the visible signature of the firing position, turned a static defense into something closer to guerrilla warfare. The farmhouse did not look fortified. It looked abandoned, and that illusion, maintained by the geometry of a single cut in the wall, was worth more than sandbags, barbed wire, or concrete. After the war, military engineers in several countries quietly studied angled firing ports as part of broader research into defensive fortifications. The United States Army, in particular, conducted tests in the 1950s on various window and loophole designs for use in urban combat. The tests confirmed what Dietrich had discovered by accident, that angled ports reduce reflection, improve concealment, and allow defenders to maintain effective fire even in poor weather. Some of these findings made it into training materials for Special Forces units. Others were classified and filed away. The slanted slot, in various forms, became part of the informal toolkit of soldiers who knew about it, even if it was never officially named or standardized. In Israel, during the urban battles of the 1970s and 1980s, soldiers fighting in stone buildings began cutting angled loopholes into walls as a matter of course. They did not know about Dietrich. They did not know about the farmhouse on the Dnieper. They simply discovered, as he had, that an angled cut worked better than a straight one. In Chechnya, Russian soldiers defending ruined apartment blocks did the same. In Iraq, American troops fortifying outposts in Ramadi and Fallujah experimented with angled firing positions to reduce the effectiveness of enemy snipers. The principle, once rediscovered, proved itself again and again, but each time it was treated as a local adaptation, a field expedient, not a fundamental piece of doctrine. This pattern of rediscovery rather than transmission speaks to a deeper failure in how military knowledge is preserved and shared. The institutional memory of an army is supposed to capture lessons learned, codify them, and pass them on to the next generation. But institutional memory is selective. It remembers battles, strategies, commanders. It does not always remember the small technical details that made those victories possible. And so, each generation of soldiers must relearn, through trial and error, what their predecessors already knew. Dietrich understood this. In one of his rare conversations about the war, recorded by Schreiber during a brief interview in 1979, he said, "The Army is very good at teaching you how to die. It is not as good at teaching you how to survive. Survival is something you learn from other soldiers, from mistakes, from desperation. If I had waited for an officer to tell me how to cut that window, I would still be waiting, and I would be dead." That sentence, stark and unsentimental, captures the reality of war at the tactical level. Officers plan, soldiers execute, and in the gap between planning and execution, in the chaos of contact, in the mud and rain and confusion, survival depends on the ability to improvise. The slanted slot was an improvisation. It was born of necessity, tested under fire and proven effective, but was never celebrated, never rewarded, never held up as an example of what soldiers should do. It was tolerated, and tolerance, in an institution built on obedience, is as close to approval as innovation usually gets. If this story teaches us anything, it is that the most important innovations are often the simplest. They do not require advanced technology, vast resources, or years of research. They require observation, creativity, and the courage to act. Dietrich saw a problem. He understood the principles involved, and he solved it with tools he had on hand. That is not genius. It is competence applied without hesitation. And in a world that often confuses complexity with sophistication, it is worth remembering that sometimes the best solution is the one that can be executed with a saw and 15 minutes of work. The farmhouse is gone now. The village where it stood has been rebuilt, renamed, and absorbed into the sprawl of modern Ukraine. The fields where 12 Soviet soldiers died in the rain are now farmland again, plowed and planted, with no marker, no memorial, no sign that anything happened there. The war moved on. The front collapsed. The survivors scattered. And the slanted slot, cut into a wall that no longer exists, became a story, then a footnote, then a faint echo in the memories of men who are themselves now gone. But the principle endures. Somewhere, in some conflict, in some desperate position, a soldier will face the same problem Dietrich faced. They will need to see without being seen. They will need to fire without drawing return fire. And if they are lucky, if they are observant, if they are willing to ignore the manual and trust their own judgment, they will find a solution. It may not be a slanted slot. It may be something else entirely, but it will be born of the same instinct, the same refusal to accept limitation, the same quiet insistence that there is always a better way if you are willing to look for it. That is a legacy of Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich. Not a medal, not a monument, not a place in the official histories. Just a window, cut wrong, that turned out be right, and the knowledge passed down through stories and whispers and the shared experience of soldiers who understand that sometimes the only way to survive is to see clearly when no one else can. Where are you watching this story from? If it made you think, if it made you question, if it reminded you that the rules are not always right, then subscribe. Because there are 1,000 stories like this, buried in the mud and rain of history, waiting to be told, and every one of them matters.